Can a single act of kindness completely change your life? A teenage boy saves a drowning dog, thinking it's just a good deed. But only hours later, he gets the shock of his life. A mysterious will names him the sole heir to a massive fortune. Who left him this wealth? And why him? Jake was just 17, a hard-working teenager trying to survive in a world that had never given him much. His father had passed away when he was little, leaving his mother to work long hours as a waitress just to keep a roof over their heads. Life had never been easy for them, and money was always tight. To help out, Jake took a part-time job at a local auto repair shop after school. The work was tough, the pay was low, and his boss, Mr. Grayson, treated him like he was worthless, constantly belittling him and making him do the dirtiest jobs. But Jake never complained. He had learned early on that life wasn't fair, and all he could do was keep pushing forward. Their town was small, a place where the divide between the wealthy and the struggling was painfully clear. On one side, luxurious mansions lined the hills, owned by people who never had to worry about their next meal. On the other, families like Jake's barely scraped by, ignored and looked down upon by the rich. Jake had always believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. He had no idea that one simple act of kindness would soon change his life forever. That evening, after another exhausting shift at the repair shop, Jake decided to take a shortcut home through the wooded area near the river. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the water, and the town was quiet. But then, he heard it. A frantic, desperate sound. A dog's bark. Jake's heart pounded as he scanned the river. That's when he saw it, a large golden retriever struggling against the rushing current. The dog's paws flailed, its head barely staying above water. It was drowning. Without hesitation, Jake threw down his backpack and ran toward the riverbank. He didn't think. He just acted. The water was freezing, the current stronger than he expected. As he swam closer, the dog thrashed in fear, making the rescue even harder. But Jake refused to let go. With all his strength, he grabbed onto the dog's collar and kicked against the current, pushing toward the shore. His muscles ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like forever, he pulled the dog onto solid ground. The retriever was weak, coughing up water, but it was alive. Its golden fur was soaked and muddy, but when it looked up at Jake, there was something in its eyes. Gratitude. Jake sat there, catching his breath, shivering from the cold. No owner was in sight. Whoever this dog belonged to, it had almost died alone. Not knowing what else to do, Jake scooped the dog into his arms and whispered, "You're safe now." Little did he know, that single moment of kindness had just rewritten his entire future. The next morning, after making sure the dog, who he decided to call Max, was fed and warm, Jake set out to find its owner. He printed a few flyers with a simple message. Found. Golden Retriever. Safe and waiting for its owner. Call Jake. Then he pinned them around town, hoping someone would recognize the dog. It didn't take long. Just a few hours later, a sleek black car pulled up outside Jake's small home. A well-dressed man in a suit stepped out, looking out of place in Jake's modest neighborhood. The man introduced himself as Mr. Bennett, the personal assistant of Richard Parker, a reclusive billionaire who lived in a mansion on the outskirts of town. Jake was stunned. Richard Parker? He had heard the name before. The man was rumored to be eccentric, rarely seen in public, and known for avoiding people. And now, his assistant was standing right here, saying that the dog belonged to him. Mr. Bennett smiled warmly when he saw Max, who immediately wagged his tail and ran to him. "Mr. Parker will be grateful," he said. "Max is the only companion. He has left." A few minutes later, Jake found himself standing in front of Parker's massive estate, something he never imagined stepping foot in. Inside, everything felt cold and grand, yet eerily empty. And then, in a grand study lined with bookshelves, Jake finally met the man himself. Richard Parker was older than Jake expected, frail-looking but with sharp, observant eyes. He sat in a leather chair, his hands resting on the armrests, as if studying the boy before him. "You saved Max," Richard said, his voice quiet but firm. "Why?" Jake blinked at the question. "Because he needed help," he said simply. "I couldn't just walk away." For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then, something softened in his expression. He nodded, as if he had found the answer to something he had been searching for. "I used to know someone like you," Richard murmured. "A long time ago." Jake didn't understand what he meant, but before he could ask, Richard simply thanked him and handed him an envelope. "A small token of appreciation," he said. Jake hesitated, but eventually took it. He didn't want a reward, but refusing might seem rude. As he left, he wondered what the old man had meant. Later that night, just as Jake was about to go to bed, he got a call that would change everything. Richard Parker was dead, and in a shocking twist, his newly updated will had just named Jake as the sole heir to his fortune. Jake couldn't believe it. Just hours ago, he had met Richard Parker for the first time. And now, the man was gone? It felt unreal, but what shocked him even more was the lawyer's next words. "Mr. Parker's will has been updated. You, Jake, are the sole heir to his entire estate." Jake's heart pounded. This had to be a mistake. Why would a billionaire leave everything to a broke teenager he had just met? He barely had time to process it when the nightmare truly began. The next morning, the news spread like wildfire. Teenager inherits billionaire's fortune, suspicious circumstances. The town was buzzing with rumors. People who had ignored Jake his whole life were now suddenly interested in him. Strangers approached him, asking for money, as if he had already received a fortune. But the worst came from Richard Parker's own relatives. At the reading of the will, Parker's distant family members, people who hadn't cared about him when he was alive, showed up furious. His nephew, Daniel Parker, was the most vocal. A man in his 40s with sharp features and an expensive suit, Daniel slammed his fist on the table. "This is absurd! This kid, this nobody, manipulated my uncle," he roared. "There is no way he would leave his entire estate to a complete stranger?" Jake felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't done anything wrong, but Daniel and the others didn't care. They were rich, powerful, and determined to make his life miserable. "We'll contest the will," Daniel sneered, pointing a finger at Jake. "You better enjoy this moment, kid, because we're going to take everything back." Jake had saved a dog's life just a day ago. Now, he was being accused of being a fraud, a con artist, a thief, and the worst part? He had no idea why Richard Parker had chosen him. The next few days were a whirlwind of chaos. News stations ran headlines like, "Did a teen manipulate a billionaire?" and "Mystery heir sparks legal battle." Strangers on social media called Jake a scammer. He couldn't walk down the street without people whispering behind his back. Meanwhile, Daniel Parker and his high-powered lawyers wasted no time filing a lawsuit to contest the will. They claimed Richard was mentally unfit when he made his decision and that Jake had somehow tricked him. Jake barely had enough money for food, let alone a legal defense. Then, just when things seemed hopeless, Mr. Bennett, the billionaire's personal assistant, reached out. He asked Jake to meet him at the Parker estate. When Jake arrived, Bennett handed him a thick envelope. "Richard knew this would happen," he said solemnly. Inside were letters, handwritten by Richard Parker himself. As Jake read, his hands trembled. Richard had chosen him for a reason. He had once been like Jake, poor, struggling, ignored by society. He had built his empire from nothing, but in the end, the wealth had only attracted greedy people who didn't care about him. He had spent years searching for someone worthy to inherit everything he built, someone who valued kindness over money. Then, the biggest revelation. A video recording of Richard Parker himself, filmed just a day before his death. Jake watched, stunned, as Richard looked into the camera and spoke. "If you're watching this, then my worst fear has come true. My family is fighting over my will. But I made my choice, and I stand by it. Jake, you remind me of the person I once was. You saved Max not because you wanted something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. That's why everything I own belongs to you now. Don't let them take it away." Jake's pulse raced. This was it, the proof he needed. With this, he had a fighting chance. But Daniel and his lawyers weren't going to back down without a fight. Armed. With Richard Parker's letters and the recorded video, Jake and Mr. Bennett took the fight to court. The evidence was undeniable. Richard had been of sound mind and had deliberately chosen Jake as his heir. The judge dismissed Daniel's lawsuit, declaring the will valid. Daniel's face turned red with fury as the verdict was announced. But his troubles didn't end there. During the investigation, it was revealed that Daniel had secretly been trying to take control of Richard's fortune for years, even attempting to manipulate his uncle into signing over assets before his death. With these revelations, Daniel not only lost the case, he faced legal consequences for fraud and financial misconduct. As for Jake, his life changed overnight. But instead of splurging on luxury, he used his newfound wealth to make a difference. He set up scholarships for struggling students, donated to animal shelters, and even helped rebuild parts of his town that had been neglected for years. Standing outside his new home, a place filled with warmth, not just wealth, Jake watched Max run happily across the yard. He had started with nothing, but through one simple act of kindness, he had gained something far more valuable than money, a chance to change lives. Just like Richard had once done. Sometimes the smallest good deed can open doors you never imagined. If you believe kindness always finds a way, let me know in the comments. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.